Sergeant Thomas Reed stepped into the Fairfield County Courthouse, his steady footsteps echoing through the vast chamber. Holding the leash of his partner, Coda, a German shepherd with an air of quiet authority, Thomas moved forward with confidence. But as he entered, the room fell into an uneasy silence. It wasn't just curiosity that lingered in the air, it was doubt. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people whispered among themselves, struggling to reconcile the badge on Thomas's chest with the fact that he was blind. Then, the sharp voice of Judge Allen Hensley cut through the tension. Known for his biting humor and ruthless wit, he wasted no time in making his opinion known. "Well, this is a first," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "Let me guess, the dog writes the reports too?" His laughter filled the room, drawing nervous chuckles from some of those in attendance. The mocking tone was clear, and for a moment, it seemed as if he had set the tone for how this hearing would proceed, but Thomas didn't flinch. His grip on Coda's leash tightened slightly, and Coda, as if sensing his partner's emotions, let out a single sharp bark that echoed through the courtroom, silencing the whispers in an instant. Still composed, Thomas turned slightly toward the judge, his voice unwavering. "Your Honor, Coda and I rescued a 7-year-old child from an armed ambush just last week. If you'd like, I can explain how we did it instead of debating who writes my reports." His words, measured and firm, cut through the tension, making it clear that he was not one to be ridiculed. The judge leaned back slightly, his smirk faltering while the rest of the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Sensing the rising tension, Prosecutor Sarah Blake stepped in. "Sergeant Reed, please tell us what happened that night. I think everyone here could learn something from your bravery." As Thomas recounted the events in vivid detail, the room grew silent once more, but this time for a different reason. He described how Coda had tracked critical clues in the midst of chaos, how he had listened intently to every sound, every shift in the air, trusting his partner completely. The story painted a picture of absolute trust and teamwork, a bond that transcended physical sight. Even the skeptics in the room seemed to reconsider their doubts, but Judge Hensley wasn't ready to back down just yet. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "A nice story," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But tell me this, how does a blind man shoot a criminal without missing? Or did the dog handle that part too?" A few muffled snickers came from the crowd, but Thomas remained steady. He exhaled slowly, then tightened his grip on Coda's leash, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Courage, Your Honor, doesn't require sight," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "It only takes heart." Coda let out another low, resolute bark, the sound cutting through the courtroom like a challenge. Judge Hensley paused, his fingers tapping against the bench, and for the first time, his smirk seemed to falter completely. The tension hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. As Thomas turned to leave, guided by Coda's steady movements, he could feel the weight of the battle ahead. Respect wasn't won in a single moment, and he knew this was just the beginning of proving himself to those who refused to see beyond his blindness. But as always, Coda was by his side, and that was all he needed. Thomas Reed sat in the quiet of his apartment, running his fingers absently through Coda's thick fur. The events of the day replayed in his mind: the courtroom, the stairs, the judge's sneering remarks. He had dealt with doubters his whole life, but something about Judge Hensley's words stuck with him. It wasn't just skepticism. It was the sheer unwillingness to believe that a blind officer could be just as capable, just as sharp, just as brave. Coda, sensing the tension in his partner, let out a soft whine and pressed closer. Thomas sighed, shaking off the lingering frustration. He had faced worse. The world had always tried to measure him by what he lacked rather than what he had, and every time he had proven them wrong. This would be no different. Just as he was settling into his thoughts, his phone buzzed. "Reed," came Captain Harris's steady voice. "You've been requested to testify in the Santiago trial." Hensley's presiding. There was a beat of silence before Harris added, "And we both know this isn't just about the case." "He's testing you." Thomas clenched his jaw, gripping Coda's leash a little tighter. "Then I guess he'll get his answer." The next morning, as Thomas stepped into the precinct, he could feel the shift in the air. Conversations quieted as he passed, unspoken questions hanging between his colleagues. He could sense the weight of their stares, some filled with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with lingering doubt. Coda, ever perceptive, pressed closer to his leg, his body alert, as if shielding Thomas from the unseen scrutiny. "Morning, Reed," Captain Harris greeted, his voice carefully neutral. "You sure about this?" Thomas turned his head slightly in Harris's direction. "I don't back down from obstacles," he replied simply. Harris exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just be ready. Hensley isn't just stubborn, he's calculated. He'll try to trip you up, make you look incapable." Thomas nodded, his resolve unshaken. He had spent his entire career proving that his skills, instincts, and training mattered more than the doubts others placed on him. As long as he had Coda by his side, he would handle whatever came next. When he arrived at the courtroom, the tension was even heavier than the day before. The Santiago trial was high profile and the stakes were enormous. As he took a seat, Coda settled at his feet, his ears twitching with every sound. The defense attorney wasted no time. "Sergeant Reed," he said, his voice sharp, "you claim that your dog Coda tracked the evidence that led to this trial. But given your condition, how can you verify what he found?" The word condition hung in the air like a veiled insult. Thomas straightened, his expression unreadable. "Coda is trained to alert me when he detects a target. His signals are clear and precise. I don't need to see to understand them. It's called trust and teamwork." The lawyer smirked. "And yet, without sight, how can you confirm that your teamwork didn't lead to mistakes? Aren't you just relying on instinct and luck?" A tense silence filled the room. Thomas let the question hang for a moment before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "Instinct and luck don't save lives. Training, discipline, and a bond built on trust do. Coda and I have been through situations most people can't imagine. We've proven ourselves time and time again, and this case is no different." Coda barked once, the sharp sound cutting through the courtroom like a declaration. Even Judge Hensley's smirk faltered. The battle wasn't over, but for now, Thomas had made his point. Thomas entered the courthouse the next morning, Coda moving confidently beside him. He had held his ground in the previous day's testimony, but he knew Judge Hensley wasn't finished. The air inside the courtroom carried a strange tension, an unspoken energy that put Coda on edge. The German Shepherd let out a low rumble of unease, pressing closer to Thomas's leg. "All rise," the bailiff called as Hensley took his seat. The judge's eyes landed on Thomas, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. "Before we continue with the trial," Hensley announced, his voice carrying an unmistakable weight, "I'd like to conduct a short demonstration. Sergeant Reed, I'd like to test the reliability of your partnership with Coda." Thomas's shoulders stiffened. A demonstration? He hadn't been warned about this. From the prosecution's table, Sarah Blake immediately stood, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular." Hensley didn't flinch. "Overruled," he said smoothly. "If Sergeant Reed's testimony relies on the abilities of his nine, then it's only fair that we confirm those abilities here in this courtroom." He turned his gaze toward Thomas, his lips curling slightly. "I assume you have no objections, Sergeant." The challenge was obvious, but Thomas refused to back down. He straightened his posture, his grip firm on Coda's leash. "None, Your Honor." The bailiff stepped forward, holding a small satchel in his hands. "This contains a decoy scent," he explained. "We've placed it somewhere in the courtroom. Let's see if Coda can locate it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Thomas knew Coda could do this. He had performed similar searches countless times, but this wasn't just a test of his dog's ability. This was about discrediting Thomas in front of everyone. He knelt beside Coda, running a steady hand over his fur. "You know what to do," he whispered. Coda's ears twitched, his body already shifting into work mode. At Thomas's command, he moved through the courtroom with careful precision, nose low to the ground, searching for the scent. The room fell silent as spectators leaned forward, watching the dog weave between benches and tables. Hensley sat back, his fingers drumming against the bench, a smug expression playing on his face. But Thomas focused only on Coda. He couldn't see him moving, but he could hear every shift, every breath, every deliberate step. Then, suddenly, Coda froze. His ears pricked forward, his tail raised. He let out a sharp bark near the back of the room, nosing the corner of a table before sitting down, his tail wagging with certainty. "Good boy," Thomas murmured with quiet pride. The bailiff approached the spot where Coda had stopped, crouched down, and retrieved the hidden satchel. "He's got it," the bailiff confirmed. A few whispers rippled through the courtroom, and Thomas could feel the subtle shift in the room. Even the skeptics seemed impressed. Judge Hensley's smirk faded slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Impressive," he admitted, though there was a begrudging tone to his voice. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "But let's not forget, Sergeant Reed, that this was a controlled environment. Out in the field, things are much less predictable. The stakes are costly, aren't they? The words were meant to plant doubt, to make the room question whether Thomas could truly handle real danger. But Thomas didn't waver. He stood tall, resting a hand on Koda's head. Mistakes are costly, Your Honor. That's why Koda and I train every day to make sure they don't happen. We've been in situations far more chaotic than this courtroom, and we've never failed each other. His voice was steady, calm, and unwavering. Koda let out a low, approving growl, as if backing his partner's words. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but for the first time, Hensley seemed at a loss for a response. Thomas knew this wasn't the end, but today, in this moment, he had won. As he exited the courthouse, the crisp winter air filling his lungs, he knew one thing for certain: he and Koda would always be ready for whatever came next. Thomas stood in the precinct's briefing room, his hands resting on Koda's leash as he listened to Captain Harris lay out the details of the upcoming raid. The Santiago Syndicate had been under investigation for months, and now, with a key informant finally talking, they had a lead on the remaining stash of evidence hidden inside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The mission was straightforward: secure the building, retrieve the evidence, and take down any remaining operatives. But Thomas knew this was more than just another assignment. Judge Hensley's words still echoed in his mind. Out in the field, things are much less predictable. Mistakes are costly, aren't they? Thomas clenched his jaw, shoving the doubt away. He had faced danger before. This was just another test, another chance to prove what he and Koda were capable of. Harris's voice pulled him back. Reed, you and Koda are leading the entry team. We've got reports of armed guards inside. If things get messy, we fall back. No unnecessary risks. Thomas gave a single nod. Understood. He crouched down, running a hand over Koda's head. You ready, buddy? Koda let out a low, eager growl, his body tensing in anticipation. Thomas felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. Whatever waited for them inside, they would face it together. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal siding blending into the darkness. The SWAT team moved in silence, their boots crunching softly against the dirt. Thomas held Koda's leash firm, his other hand resting near his holstered weapon. His senses were heightened, every sound amplified in the still night. As they reached the side entrance, Koda suddenly stiffened, letting out a quiet whine, his signal for nearby movement. Thomas signaled for the team to halt, tilting his head slightly to pick up what Koda had already detected. Faint voices. The distinct metallic sound of a weapon being loaded. They weren't alone. We've got movement inside, Thomas whispered into his radio. The tension thickened. Time to move. Go, he ordered, releasing Koda's leash. The dog shot forward like a bullet, disappearing into the shadows. Moments later, a sharp bark rang out, followed by the chaos of bodies colliding. Shouts and gunfire erupted, filling the warehouse with noise. Thomas moved fast, trusting Koda to do what he did best. He ducked behind a stack of crates, listening for his partner's signal. Then there it was, a second bark, closer this time. Thomas rounded the corner just in time to see Koda pinning a man to the ground, his jaws locked onto the suspect's arm, preventing him from reaching a fallen weapon. Hey, Koda, Thomas commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The dog froze, still gripping but not biting down further. Thomas kicked the weapon away and secured the suspect with zip ties. Good boy, he murmured, giving Koda a quick pat before turning his attention to the rest of the warehouse. Reed, we've got a problem, Harris's voice crackled through the radio. Secondary room, heavily barricaded. We think the main stash is in there? Can you and Koda clear a path? Thomas exhaled sharply, already moving toward the back of the building. We're on it, he responded. Koda stayed close, his body taut with energy. The door in front of them was thick metal, likely reinforced, but Koda had already begun sniffing along the edges, searching for a weak point. Within seconds, he stopped and let out a soft bark, his tail held stiff. You found something, huh? Thomas muttered, running his hands along the area Koda had pinpointed. There, barely perceptible, a faint draft leaked through a narrow gap. Thomas turned toward the team. 3, maybe 4 inside, he estimated. He reached down, brushing his fingers briefly through Koda's fur before giving the command. Back. The dog retreated, crouching low. Breaching in 3, 2. The explosion of the door being forced open sent the room into chaos once more. Shots rang out. Voices shouted in panic, but Thomas moved with precision, relying on Koda's guidance. In the end, the room was cleared, the evidence secured, and the Santiago operation dismantled for good. As the dust settled, Thomas knelt beside Coda, running a hand down his back. "We did it, buddy," he said, a rare smile breaking across his face. But even as they made their way back to the precinct, he knew this wasn't just about taking down criminals. This was about proving something to Hensley, to the department, and to himself. And tonight, he and Coda had done just that. Thomas stood outside the warehouse, gripping Coda's leash as the cold night air pressed against his skin. The Santiago Syndicate's last known operation was inside, along with the evidence they needed to dismantle the organization for good. The SWAT team around him moved with quiet precision, their low murmurs barely audible over the distant hum of the city. This wasn't just another raid, it was the final piece of a case months in the making. But for Thomas, it was more than that. He knew Hensley's words still lingered in the minds of those watching him, waiting to see if a blind officer could handle the unpredictability of a real mission. There was no controlled courtroom here, no staged demonstration, just the raw, unfiltered reality of the job. He crouched beside Coda, running a steady hand over the dog's back. "You ready?" Coda's ears twitched, his muscles tense with anticipation. Thomas didn't need to see his partner to know he was locked in, ready to do what he was trained for. "Let's move," he murmured, signaling the team forward. The group advanced, their footsteps barely whispering over the dirt. As they reached the side entrance, Coda suddenly halted, his body rigid. Thomas felt the shift immediately, his grip tightening on the leash. Coda let out a quiet whine, his silent signal for nearby movement. Thomas stilled, listening. Then he heard it, the faint shuffle of boots, the click of a safety being disengaged. "We've got movement inside," he whispered into his radio. "Weapons ready." Before another second passed, Coda surged forward at Thomas's command, his body a blur of motion. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Shouts rang out, followed by the sharp, unmistakable sound of gunfire. The SWAT team moved in sync, fanning out across the space, but Thomas's focus was on Coda. He could hear his partner weaving through the darkness, each bark and growl a sign of engagement. Trusting his instincts, Thomas moved swiftly through the maze of crates, his weapon raised, every sound painting a picture of the scene around him. Then he heard a scuffle, a sharp intake of breath, then a bark that sent a clear signal. Thomas moved fast. Rounding the corner, he found Coda locked onto an armed suspect, the man's free hand clawing desperately for a dropped pistol inches away. "Hold," Thomas commanded. Coda froze, his teeth still gripping the man's arm but holding firm, waiting for further orders. Thomas kicked the weapon out of reach, securing the suspect with quick efficiency. "Good boy," he murmured, giving Coda's fur a quick ruffle before moving forward. But the fight wasn't over yet. Harris's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Reed, the main stash is behind a reinforced barricade. Can you and Coda clear the path?" Thomas exhaled sharply. "We're on it." At the far end of the warehouse, the barricaded door stood thick and solid, but Thomas knew Coda could find the weak point. He ran his hand along the cold metal as Coda sniffed diligently, searching for the smallest gap. Within seconds, the dog let out a soft bark, his tail held stiff. "Found it, huh?" Thomas muttered, feeling the slight draft Coda had pinpointed. He turned toward the team. 3, maybe 4 inside. Harris gave the go-ahead and Thomas pulled Coda back, breaching in 3, 2. The door blasted open, sending splinters flying. The room erupted with noise, shouts, footsteps, the rapid fire of suppressed rounds. Coda lunged first, moving with the deadly precision of his training, taking down a man before he could even lift his weapon. Thomas followed, his instincts guiding him as he navigated the battlefield. When the dust settled, the evidence was secure, and the Santiago operation was over. Thomas knelt beside Coda, rubbing a hand down his back. "We did it, buddy," he said, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As they walked back out into the night, the weight of what they had just accomplished settled over him. Hensley's doubts, the whispers in the department, none of it mattered now. He and Coda had once again proven what they already knew. They belonged here. Thomas stepped into the precinct, Coda walking proudly at his side. The air was different now. There was no more hesitation in the glances of his colleagues, no more whispers hanging between conversations. Instead, there was something else, something stronger: respect. The Santiago operation had been a success, and the evidence they had secured would dismantle the crime syndicate for good. But Thomas knew this victory meant more than just closing a case. It was proof. Proof that he and Coda could handle anything thrown their way, that his blindness was not a limitation, but a challenge he had long since conquered. As he made his way to his desk, Captain Harris approached, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hell of a job out there, Reed," he said. There was no doubt in his voice, no undertone of concern, just recognition. Thomas nodded, giving Kota a small pat. "Just another day on the job, Cap." But even as he spoke the words, he knew this one had meant more. He had faced doubt, scrutiny, and a judge who had tried to reduce him to his blindness instead of recognizing his skill. And yet here he stood, stronger than before. Later that afternoon, Thomas found himself back in the familiar courtroom. This time, he wasn't walking in to defend himself, he was there to close the Santiago case for good. As he took his seat, Kota resting calmly at his feet, his ears perked up at the sound of Judge Hensley clearing his throat. The judge studied Thomas for a long moment, his usual smirk absent. The courtroom was silent, waiting for him to speak. Finally, Hensley leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. "Sergeant Reed," he said slowly, his tone unreadable. "I may not always be an easy man to impress, but..." He paused, glancing briefly at Kota before continuing. "It seems you and your partner have a habit of proving people wrong." There were no jokes, no sarcastic jabs, just acknowledgement. Thomas didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, he gave a small nod. "We do our jobs, Your Honor." "That's all." Hensley exhaled, a flicker of something passing through his expression before he straightened. "Well then," he said, his voice returning to its usual sharpness. "Let's proceed." Thomas knew better than to expect an apology, but he didn't meet one. The work spoke for itself. And, more importantly, the people who once doubted him had finally seen what he had always known to be true. He and Kota were a team. A damn good one. As Thomas and Kota stepped out into the crisp evening air, he took a slow, steady breath. He thought about every moment that had led him here, the ridicule, the challenges, the moments of doubt, not just from others, but from himself. He thought about the way people always tried to measure him by what they assumed he lacked rather than by what he had. And yet, he had never let that stop him. The world often places limits on people, defining them by what they see rather than by who they are. But Thomas had learned long ago that the only opinion that truly mattered was the one he carried within himself. He reached down, brushing his fingers through Kota's fur, feeling the steady strength of the partner who had never once doubted him. "Not bad, huh, buddy?" Kota wagged his tail, his silent way of agreeing. With one last glance at the courthouse behind him, Thomas turned toward the city ahead, ready for whatever came next. Because at the end of the day, courage wasn't about sight, it was about heart, and that was something he and Kota had in abundance.